The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 17th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. And his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up, and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. The season of Epiphany has been a season of signs. Signs pointing to something more great and more glorious than seems to exist on the surface, telling us that this Jesus is more than what he seems. The first sign, of course, the star of Bethlehem, the star in the sky that told all of the planet, indeed, that something was happening. Something was happening in the land of Judea, that a king was being born. And distant travelers from the Orient came to see what this king meant for the world. Anyone to see a sign in the sky, in the heavens, a marker that something great was taking place on planet Earth. And then a baptism where the skies open and a dove descends and a voice speaks and says, "This is my Son, with whom I am well pleased." Another sign to demonstrate that this man, Jesus, is more than just a man, is unlike any other person the world had ever seen. And then a miracle, the turning of water into wine, demonstrating again that Jesus holds power over the elements of this world themselves. And of course, in a series of signs to follow. But then all of that leading up to this final sign in the season of Epiphany. This final sign, the Transfiguration, where what looks like an everyday Middle Eastern man is suddenly transfigured into something beyond measure, something that awes and inspires the disciples who see it. They're at a loss for words, and they can't help but maybe build a monument for what they've seen. It's the kind of God that we want. The kind of God that reveals God in majesty and glory and leaves no doubt. Robes glowing white and a face that radiates like the sun at night nonetheless. And the disciples are utterly stunned. What is happening? But then Peter recognizes this is a glorious moment. Look, God has shown up in all God's majesty. I didn't give my life up to follow some guy. I gave up my life to follow this. Majesty, might, power, glory, and look who stands on his side, the bringer of the law, Moses, and the great prophet Elijah, two figures in history that are unmatched. They stand by his side and talk to him as if he is greater than them both. And Peter says, let's build a monument to recognize this momentous occasion. God is who we thought he was. All the glory and might. Man, that's the God we want to follow. And it's revealed in this. And yet, he says, tell no one. Tell no one. As if he knows God's glory won't be revealed in might and majesty. God's glory will be revealed on another mountain called the Skull, where they will take this mighty man and crucify him. How can we understand all the power of the universe wrapped up in a single individual, and yet an incredible act of violence and fear and misunderstanding would allow for him to die in a most gruesome and terrible way? And yet in the suffering and the death on that mountain, God's glory would be revealed. Not on the mountain of Transfiguration, but on the mountain of the Skull would we see the nature of God made visible for all to see, for the public to gather and to uphold, to see with their own eyes how deep God will go to connect with the reality of our brokenness. And how then does this relate to us? Perhaps it is not in the mighty moments of our lives that God is most visible, but in the broken moments, in the times of loss and despair, in the times where there seems to be no hope and nothing left for us, that God humbles God's self to our level and comes as a broken one just like us, revealing that glory in God's eyes is about humility and self-sacrifice, about love, about letting go of power, about giving up glory, to see glory in a new way, in a new light. In the darkness of that hillside, Jesus sets us free, not in the brightness of Transfiguration. So I wonder, in your own lives, where have you experienced God most strongly? When have you experienced God most strongly? Where you can say, I don't know if God has always been with me, and hopefully you know that God always has. But you can say, in this moment, I know God was with me for sure. In that place, in that time, I knew I was not alone. That God was with me. And maybe that was in a time of great despair. I don't know. You can name that for yourself. But when was a time where you really felt God's presence in your life? Where God seemed to make God's self known in a new way, in a deeper way, in a more meaningful way, in a way that you could almost reach out and touch. When was that moment, that time? Or maybe there's multiple times. But when was a time where you really felt God's presence in your life? And yes, of course, I'm going to invite you to share it. So I'm going to invite you to turn and share it with the person you're with, perhaps, or somebody next to you. a time where you really felt God's presence in your life, where you really felt that God was there for you at that time or with you. I'm reminded of that very famous poem of Footsteps in the Sand, right? Where an individual looks back on their life and there's two sets of footprints in the sand, one their own and one the Lord's. And then they look at the troubling times of their life and they see only one set of footprints, and they ask the Lord, Lord, why in those times that were most troubling are there only one set? And the Lord replies, because it was in those times that I carried you. When have you felt God carry you in your life? When you don't know how you'd have got through it if God hadn't been there. So I invite you, take a minute, a piece, turn to one another, share, and then hear what others have to say, a time where you felt God's presence in your life. Go ahead and do that now. Okay, friends, if I can get your attention again. I invite you to continue that conversation. If not over pancakes, which is a great time to do it downstairs, then maybe on the car ride home or the next chance you get to be in conversation with one another, a time where you really felt God's presence in your life. So often we keep these things secret, and they're not actually meant to be secret at all. They're meant to be shared at the right time, right? Jesus says, you know what you saw here, right? In the Transfiguration, you know what you saw. Just don't tell anybody yet. He does not say don't tell anyone ever. Don't tell anyone yet. There will come a day when it will be the right time for you to share. And I think so often that is true in our own lives. That these moments that God breaks into our lives, God does for a reason. And they're part of our story, but God also invites us to share our story with others in the right time in the right place. When all of a sudden it feels like, yeah, no, this is the right time for me to share what God was up to in that moment so that others may hear that God is at work in this world, not distant and far away, but in fact engaged in the human story at our level now. And if we find ourselves in the midst of fear and trembling, keep in mind that's how the disciples end at the Transfiguration, utterly terrified at what they had just witnessed. And then Jesus reaches out and touches them and says, "It's all right." And when they look up, it is all right again. And what had scared them is now gone. And what do they see? Their Lord guiding them to the next place. So when we feel these moments of loss and abandonment, keep in mind that it's then, almost always then, that Jesus reaches out and touches us and says, "Do not be afraid. I've got you. I've got this." And picks us back up and moves us back forward in our day. And then reminds us there will come a time when we will get to share our story. May that time come, and may it come soon, and may it be glorious. There you go. Glorious. Amen.